The scent of expensive cologne mixed with leather and cedarwood filled the air as I pulled open the top drawer of my husband's desk. I wasn't snooping. At least that's what I told myself. I was looking for my watch, the one he borrowed last week and never returned. But as I reached inside, my fingers brushed against something unexpected. A small velvet jewelry box. My heart skipped. He never bought me jewelry without an occasion. Curious, I flipped open the lid. Inside sat a delicate bracelet, diamonds woven into a gold chain. Elegant. Understated. Exactly my taste. But beneath it, tucked into the velvet, was a small folded note. Can't wait to see you again. Last night was unforgettable. It wasn't my handwriting. My stomach twisted. My hands felt cold. I stared at the words, my mind scrambling for an explanation. A misunderstanding. A mistake. Maybe a joke? But deep down I already knew. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. I snapped the box shut and shoved it back into the drawer just as my husband walked in. What are you doing? His voice was casual but his eyes studied me. Looking for my watch. I forced a smile. He nodded but something in his gaze lingered. A flicker of something unreadable. I didn't confront him. Not yet. That I watched. The way he held his phone closer. The way he left the room to take calls. The way he smiled. A little too easily, like a man with a secret. That afternoon, a new presence entered our home. The architect. Confident. His handshake firm, his eyes sharp. When he looked at me, it wasn't like the others. Those polite, detached glances I was used to. His gaze held for just a second too long, his expression unreadable. And for the first time in years I felt something stir inside me. The sound of hammering and distant voices echoed through the house. A constant reminder of the project my husband insisted on starting. The architect moved through the space like he belonged there, confident, focused, always aware of his surroundings. Every time I turned a corner he was there. In the hallway by the staircase, near the back patio where I liked to drink my coffee. It wasn't intentional, at least it didn't seem like it, but I started noticing him everywhere. His presence was impossible to ignore. This time it happened in the kitchen. I reached for a glass, not realizing he was beside me. My fingers brushed against his. Warm, solid, lingering for just a second longer than necessary. I pulled back, feeling something unfamiliar twist inside me. He didn't apologize. He didn't step away. He just held my gaze, unreadable, before turning back to his work. That night I called my best friend, needing to talk, needing clarity, but she changed the subject too quickly. Avoiding. Deflecting. Hours later, a message lit up my phone. Don't trust anyone. My chest tightened. What did she know? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as he gestured toward the rooftop terrace. You should see the view, he said, his voice calm, steady, like he already knew I would follow. I hesitated, then stepped onto the unfinished wooden planks, feeling the crisp breeze brush against my skin. The city stretched below, golden light reflecting off the glass windows of distant buildings. It was beautiful, but I barely noticed. He stood too close. The wind picked up suddenly, pushing against me, and I lost my balance for just a second. Strong hands caught my waist, steadying me before I could fall. His grip was firm, his body warm against mine, and I should have stepped away, but I didn't. His breath was close, his eyes unreadable, and before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the space between us. My lips met his, soft, deliberate, a choice made in a heartbeat. The world tilted. Then reality crashed back. I pulled away, pulse racing, and without a word I turned and left, my mind already drowning in the weight of what I had just done. But I knew I'd do it again. That evening he did something he hadn't done in years. He asked me to have dinner with him. No clients, no business calls, just the two of us at our favorite restaurant. He ordered my usual without asking, poured my wine, looked at me like he was searching for something. His voice was softer, his touch lingering when he reached for my hand. It felt wrong. Forced. A performance. Guilt crawled under my skin, but my mind wasn't here. It was on the rooftop, on the way his hands had held me steady, on the feeling I still couldn't shake. I smiled at my husband, forced laughter where it belonged, pretended nothing had changed. But something had. The next morning, I noticed his right-hand man watching me. Always nearby, always listening. It wasn't paranoia, I could feel it. A quiet calculation behind his eyes. That afternoon I found my husband's phone left on his desk, unlocked. My pulse pounded. I reached for it, hesitated. One swipe and I could see everything. My fingers hovered over the screen. One decision. That's all it would take. My fingers hovered over the screen, my heart pounding, but at the last second I pulled away. I couldn't do it. I told myself it was principle, that I wasn't the kind of woman who invaded her husband's privacy, but deep down I knew the truth. I was afraid of what I'd find. Instead, I agreed to another dinner. Another attempt at pretending. He was charming, attentive, the way he used to be in the beginning. He talked about future plans, places we should visit, the kind of life we could still have. I wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the warmth of his presence again, but when he leaned in and kissed me, something inside me recoiled. His lips were familiar, but the feeling was gone. I kissed him back anyway, trying to convince myself I still belonged here. That night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. One message. One sentence. We need to talk. It's important. My stomach tightened. I already knew who it was. And I already knew I would go. I met him in the dimly lit back corner of a quiet cafe, away from familiar eyes. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. I saw him, he said, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. Your husband. Last week. He wasn't alone. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay still. You're mistaken, I said, but even I didn't believe the words. He leaned in, lowering his voice. I know what I saw. The air between us thickened, heavy with something unspoken. The drive home was a blur. My hands shook as I reached for my husband's phone that night, but again I hesitated. I wasn't ready. I needed confirmation, needed someone else to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. I called my best friend, but the way she sighed before answering told me everything. Some things are better left alone, she murmured, her voice softer than usual. My throat tightened. That night, as I stared out the bedroom window, a dark figure stood across the street, motionless. Watching. A chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. The house was silent when I finally did it. My hands were steady, but my heart pounded as I swiped open my husband's phone. Messages. Dozens of them. A name I didn't recognize. Last night was perfect. I miss you already. My vision blurred, rage and humiliation crashing over me in waves. He hadn't even bothered to hide it. I stared at the screen, my breath sharp, my chest tight. It was real. It had always been real. No more doubts. No more pretending. I grabbed my keys and left. This time I wasn't hiding. The architect opened the door before I knocked, like he had been expecting me. His eyes searched mine, and without a word he stepped aside, letting me in. The moment the door clicked shut, I exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But then, before I could speak, before I could even think, the door swung open again, fast, sharp. My stomach dropped. There she was, my best friend, standing in the doorway, holding up her phone, recording. I told you, she whispered. You should have listened. The room felt too small, the air too thick. My best friend stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, her phone raised. You really thought he wouldn't check? Her voice was eerily calm, almost amused. My stomach twisted. I followed her gaze as she turned the screen toward me. The realization hit like a freight train. A live stream. My blood ran cold. I stepped forward, pulse hammering, but before I could speak, my phone buzzed. My husband's name flashed on the screen. A slow, crushing silence settled over the room. He had seen everything. The weight of it pressed down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. The architect's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. And then footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. The door behind my friend creaked open and two men stepped inside. My husband's right-hand man. And someone else. Taller. Broader. Their faces blank, unreadable. My throat went dry. My friend slipped her phone into her pocket, lips curling into something almost like pity. You really should have been more careful. The silence was suffocating. My husband stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady. He didn't ask for explanations, didn't demand answers. He just looked at me like I was already gone. Then, with a voice colder than I'd ever heard, he said one word. Leave. My chest tightened. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My eyes darted around the room. My suitcase sat by the door, neatly packed. He had been ready for this. I turned to the architect, searching for something. Reassurance, regret, anything. But he wouldn't meet my gaze. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the floor like he wanted to disappear. My stomach twisted. He wasn't going to fight for me. He never was. A soft laugh came from behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was her. My best friend, the person I trusted most. She leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. I warned you. The weight of it all crushed me. My marriage, my reputation, my future, gone in an instant. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. The walls of the apartment felt like they were closing in. Peeling paint, a cheap mattress, a window that barely let in light. This was my life now. Everything I had, gone. No sprawling house, no designer clothes, no security. Just silence and the crushing weight of regret. I tried calling him. The architect. Over and over. Each time it went straight to voicemail. He had disappeared like none of it ever happened. My messages stayed unread, my calls ignored. He was gone. Just like her. My best friend, the woman who once knew everything about me, had vanished too. No explanations, no goodbyes. I stared at my phone, fingers hovering over the screen, knowing I shouldn't look but doing it anyway. One tap and my husband's profile appeared. The first post was a picture. Him smiling, standing next to a younger woman. His hand on her waist, hers resting on his chest. The caption was simple. New beginnings. My chest tightened as a message popped up. His name. One sentence. You're free now. Isn't this what you wanted? My vision blurred. I had lost everything. And no one was coming to save me.